All right. We have everyone for the grand double length AMA. Not sure we'll go the entire time, but we'll see how many questions there are. I wanted to kick things off real quick with the announcement of the bean count, the Guess the Beans giveaway. Okay, let's see if the winner is here. No, but that was not a requirement. All right, so the count of the beans was 869, and I did it myself, and a half bean counted as a half bean. There were two half beans, and the closest one was E-Real at 850. So congratulations, E-Real. And second honorable mention was we have Snaked at 843. We have Bean Counter at 903. So that is that. Well, we're already 7:31 here, so without much further ado, we can hand it over to Publius. We do have the meetings on Thursday for the DAO. There's a lot of new snapshots up for vote, so head over to Snapshot. There should be an announcement in the announcement channel for that. And other than that, Publius, go ahead.
Thanks, Dumpling. So we're going to run this how we typically run the AMAs, which is, a little bit more long form and very much open-ended. And so anything that is on people's mind or they're curious about or concerned about or would like more information about for whatever reason, feel free to come up here and ask your questions. You can raise your hand and we'll bring you up here. And I think Dumpling, maybe IPO and Chill will help moderate, and we're happy to answer, whatever's on your mind.
IPO, I can't bring you up on stage, but you can just come up on stage. So just try to come up. I think we've just given Otto permission to come up on stage. I'm sure you'll come up pretty soon, IPO.
Sorry, IPO, I think you have to take your hand down and then you can rejoin. So I think you have to cancel your request, IPO.
I'm going to look into the settings for this because this seems to be a recurring thing. We should probably either make it hands or no hands. Okay, so you can either post your questions in the AMA questions, which we already looks like we have a couple. So we'll start there, and then you can also raise your hand, and people can feel free to come up on stage. Okay, so from Puissance, we have, how is Beanstalk Farms funded at present? And how will Beanstalk Farms be funded in its decentralized future?
Beanstalk Farms was recently funded for the first quarter of 2022 by BIP8, which the silo voted to mint additional beans, in total 2 million beans, and allocate 60% of them to Beanstalk Farms and the remaining 40% to Bean Sprout. And so Beanstalk Farms has 1.2 million beans to operate through the end of the quarter, and that was funded by the silo. In terms of long-term funding, in general, the hope is that maintenance for Beanstalk and like the protocol itself will decrease over time. Right now, there's a lot of growth necessary in terms of development of the protocol and a lot of different things around the protocol, whereas perhaps in a little bit of a longer term time horizon, there will be a larger ecosystem around Beanstalk that doesn't necessarily need to be entirely funded by the silo. So our expectation is that that amount of funding on a quarterly basis probably won't increase too much beyond what it currently is, at least for the time being, at Beanstalk's current size. And with regards to maintaining that in a decentralized fashion, the hope is to continue to further improve the decentralization of the teams working on Beanstalk. And so the one of the benefits of the structure of the BIP8 funding is that Beanstalk Farms and Beansprout are funded somewhat independently. And so there is now two separate, even though they're obviously coordinating, two separate independent operations working on making Beanstalk the ubiquitous stablecoin of DeFi. So in general, that's pretty exciting. Where the protocol has come over the past 5 months, and our expectation is that from a development perspective, the team that is supporting Beanstalk will continue to be, increasing in its decentralization over time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the silo will not continue to have funding and grants for various things that benefit Beanstalk.
IPO, welcome
Dumpling,
to the
I figured
stage.
it out.
Hey.
Yeah, no, it was weird. I'm doing it on desktop, so I had to rewind. But thanks for bringing me up. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's keep it going. I guess the only thing I just wanted to say, I'm looking in the audience, looks like there are a couple of new folks. Welcome to the first 2022 Beanstalk AMA in lieu of class. Most of the class sessions to operate like AMAs anyway, but like Publius and Dumpling said, this is a bit longer form. No question is out of bounds. So obviously, if you have questions, you can put them in the AMA questions channel, as some of you already have. Or, as we get through the conversation, feel free to raise your hand and we could bring you up on stage. This is being recorded, as you'll see if you're looking at the users. So in the event you do have to drop off a little bit later, or even now, you can listen to it at a later time via Spotify or the other channels, along with the other AMAs. And, if you're new to Beanstalk, the AMAs really are the best opportunity, not just to ask questions, but even to just listen and learn if you don't know enough to ask anything at all. I tend to learn something new every single time I join one of these. So I'm super excited to be here. And obviously, if, not to have to say this, but I think we're all adults here, although you can't tell from the profile pictures. But, obviously, this is a forum for us to just learn and, basically build the community. So any kind of disruptive behavior obviously won't be tolerated. But we've never had a problem with that. And we continue to not have problems with that. So that's all good. But I guess before we get into some of these questions, we got into one. I think it would be a good idea, Publius, just to level set, in terms of we're in 2022. There's a ton of stuff going on. What are the key big things that we're looking to do in this quarter?
Thank you, IPO and Chill. It's nice to have you up here. We have, on the one hand, when it comes to timing things out specifically, it's a little bit difficult to project how much we'll be able to get done in Q1 specifically. So to lay out what the next couple of weeks and months look like, and that may extend into longer than that, the model has continued to be refined over the past couple of weeks through things like BIP9. And while there are some more, more and more minor tweaks, if you will, to the model we can make to improve its efficiency, in general, the Beanstalk changes itself are going to decrease in scope going forward. Instead, the focus is now on building out a larger ecosystem around Beanstalk, which consists of liquidity around a variety of Beanstalk's assets. So pods, stock, and seeds, and continuously improving liquidity for beans as well. So this week, Beanstalk Farms deployed a Bean3 curve pool on Curve, which currently still doesn't have a lot of liquidity, particularly, but that's mainly because there are no incentives in any capacity for adding liquidity. And over the next month, one of the things that we hope to accomplish is to incorporate the Bean3 curve pool into the silo and into the minting schedule for Beanstalk. So have the 3 curve pool fully integrated into Beanstalk. And then also to make a proposal to have the Bean3 curve pool listed on Curve, which will hopefully also open up Beanstalk to a wider audience that may not immediately be interested in Beanstalk native interest at the start. So over the month of January, and it may leak into February, we hope to integrate Curve into Beanstalk. Now, beyond that, the hope is to add convert functionality so that you can convert between the Curve pool and the Uniswap pool efficiently within the silo, but that might take a little bit more development time because it is a little bit more complex. But in general, one of the things that is on our radar is to fully integrate Curve and the Curve pool into Beanstalk. Now, another thing that's on the radar for January is the pod marketplace. So the hope is that before the end of the month, the V1 for the pod marketplace can be proposed as a BIP. And the pod marketplace is very exciting because it should both introduce a lot of or create a lot of utility for pods, which can have a generally positive effect on the demand for soil in general, but also is likely to create some demand for beans because of the structure of the market. So one of the things that goes into the analysis of how to build things out is to ensure that, or at least to optimize around having it have a net positive effect on demand for beans. And so in the case of the pod marketplace, bids will be denominated in beans. And accordingly, even to place a bid, that requires you to own beans. So that if someone has a plot and sells it into your bid, there's no additional action necessary from the bidder. They need to deposit the beans or stake the beans into the pod marketplace. And so that's an example of over the next couple of weeks, another not change, but another step in the right direction for Beanstalk to build out its ecosystem. Now, beyond pod liquidity through the pod marketplace, the stock and seeds should become fungible in the not too distant future. So now we probably get into February, maybe even March. But the hope is to have our intention is to deploy a balancer bean, stock, and seed pool, and to allow, similar to the Curve integration, to allow the LP tokens for the balancer pool to be deposited in the silo as well and receive additional stock and seeds. Now, in order to prevent excess stock and seed inflation, you probably won't receive as many stock and seeds per bean denominated value deposited. We're still figuring out the finer details of those rates and the best way to set that from a theoretical perspective, at least. But in general, the hope is that by the end of the quarter, there will be real liquidity on pods, stock, and seeds. And the nature of the stock and seed balancer pool deployment, where you need beans, stock, and seeds, will likely result in a lot of the beans that are currently in the silo moving over to the balancer pool. So our expectation is that the assets within the silo are going to have increased utility in the near future through the stock and seed pool. So those are over the next couple of months, the Beanstalk native pieces of development that we're focused on. Now, as the ecosystem continues to grow, the hope is that there are other protocols that are either independently or through coordination with Beanstalk Farms or Beansprout starting to work on Beanstalk and utilize beans or various assets within the ecosystem. And so, in addition to just Beanstalk Farms doing its job of continuing to work on the development of the protocol, uh, the hope is that Beanstalk starts to be integrated within the larger Ethereum DeFi ecosystem. At some point over the next 2 months, we do hope to have the initial audit from Omniscia completed. Now, there is going to be a little bit of complexity because we are continuing to push out so many bits in short fashion that even as they start to review one version of the code, things continue to change, like the addition of the pod marketplace through a BIP. And so there may need to be an extension of the Omniscia audit beyond its just initial stage to get to a place where the latest version of the code is up to date. But in general, we're excited that they've started the audit and are, working on auditing Beanstalk. So that's exciting. And beyond that would probably be, the extent of the goals that we're willing to commit to for Q1. To be perhaps a little bit more ambitious, and it's unlikely to happen within Q1, although there's a lot of positive things happening around Beanstalk that it's possible, but it's more likely to be in Q2, where Beanstalk starts to have Beanstalk deployments on various other blockchains in addition to Ethereum. And so we've been doing a lot of research on various cross-chain bridging and, more importantly, messaging solutions such that the various Beanstalk contracts that are on the different blockchains will be able to communicate back and forth. And we're highly encouraged by Seller Network. We found them to be very much ahead of the curve, and we think that within the not too distant future, that will enable a more generalized cross-chain Beanstalk infrastructure or implementation. And our hope, in the spirit of really maximizing the extent of the decentralization here, is to actually find at least one other high-quality cross-chain messaging platform to also facilitate sort of like a double check or even a triple check if we can find more than one, such that there's very little risk that any single actor or set of actors can have an adverse effect on the entire Beanstalk ecosystem. So that might be more like what Q2 goals look like. But we are talking to AVAX and hoping to get the conversation started with Solana in the near future as well. So there's a lot of, and that's in addition to ETH-L2s. So there's a lot of very exciting, larger long-term developments that Beanstalk Farms is actively working on. But for Q1, we're focused on getting liquidity to all of the Beanstalk native assets and, helping facilitate integrations across Ethereum mainnet. Those would be the main priorities at the moment.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, that was a lot. For those listening, just to recap, or even to step back a little bit, heading into 2022, we had a pretty major development. We had the price, effectively the price stability development that passed, where folks can convert either ETH into Beans or Beans into ETH, depending on the price of Bean, and that's reflected in the price of Bean, as you can see, even as the broader market continues to bleed. And then the things you mentioned were, many of those things are top of mind for folks looking at the questions. But the curve pool, the pod marketplace, we still have the NFT NFTs Part 2 going. So if you haven't grabbed your NFT, feel free to go do that. And, that's also resulted in the Omnitia audit being funded, which you touched on. So certainly a lot going on. And to your point, a very, it shouldn't really be considered ambitious, but a very active, I should say, Q1 heading into Q2. A couple things to talk about. You mentioned seed and stock fungibility and liquidity. The community continues to be very, very excited for this. What are some of the concerns, if there are any, of how those would trade? For instance, one that was mentioned, what if in some situation the relative price of stock to beans, becomes very, very high or becomes, somewhat ridiculous to the point where it becomes hard for folks to either withdraw beans because they'll lose too much stock, or they'll get a crazy amount of stock by simply depositing bean, given how it could be trading. Is that something that is a concern or something we've thought about?
Yeah, it's the initial rollout of the stock and seed bean balancer pool is a little bit more complex to do properly than the Bean 3 curve pool rollout, because of the unique nature of the relationship between Beanstalk and seeds. So there is potentially problems if they're priced too high, and similarly potentially problems if they're priced too low relative to a bean. So the question that was asked, I believe, said, well, what if it's like 5 beans per stock? The arbitrage opportunity to sell that one stock into 5 beans and then deposit those 5 beans in the silo for 5 stock plus additional seeds effectively makes that situation impossible. However, in a scenario where 1 stock and 2 seeds, which is roughly the what you would expect, assuming that there was no additional inflation grown stock or from additional, like, putting stock and seeds and beans in the pool, you would expect the price to be around 1 bean is equal to around 1 stock plus 2 seeds. And if you enable rolling that over, so now you deposit your bean, you get 1 stock and 2 seeds, and then you can immediately convert all of that into balancer LP and then receive additional stock and seeds. If the bean denominated value of that is really high, and on top of that, you get a high number of stock and seeds per bean denominated value that you deposit, that could result in excess stock and seed inflation, which isn't the worst thing in the world because that would just result in a decrease in the price. But at the same time, you don't want the price to go too low, which would be one of the reasons you don't want the price to be too high at the beginning to cause excess inflation. Because if you're able to buy, 10 stock and 20 seeds on the open market for 1 bean, let's call it, there may not be as much of an incentive to buy a bean on the open market and deposit it in the silo as much as there is just an incentive to buy stock and seeds. And so obviously, if the balancer pool is bean, stock, and seeds, you still need to acquire beans to buy stock and seeds. But there's an interesting interplay between how that could affect outflows of beans, because if someone has deposited beans where they only got 1 stock and 2 seeds, and maybe that's turned into 2 stock and 2 seeds, and now they can take that 1 bean, withdraw it from the silo, and buy 10 stock and 20 seeds, that they're probably going to do that. That may not cause an outflow from the ecosystem. That may just lead to an equilibrium in the stock and seed price at some point. But there is something to be said for trying to get the initial rollout done in a way such that there's less volatility than might exist in a state where there's a suboptimal rollout. But in general, we don't expect there to be a particularly large risk associated with the stock and seed rollout from an economic perspective, given that the pool requires in order for you to buy stock and seeds, you need beans. But as we discussed, there are some risks associated with excess volatility that could be caused from this launch if stock and seeds are improperly priced and there's excess liquidity at a bad price.
Got it. And even ahead of the launch for fungibility or tradability between stock and seeds and bean and the other coins in the ecosystem, right now or since the inception of the protocol, it seems there obviously is a relative difference between the amount of seeds that you get. If you put beans in the silo, you get 2. If you put beans in the LP, you get 4. Theoretically, if folks are acting super rationally and they have a long-term view, then that would theoretically incentivize, more entry into the LP, all else equal. Is that something that we would reconsider at any point in time? For instance, if we were to change the relative amount of seeds that you get for either of those actions, meaning let's say, we were to change via BIP or however it is, now for every bean deposit into the silo, you still get 2 seeds, but into the LP, you get 10. Is that something we've considered or you would consider? And if so, what would the effects of that be, negative or positive?
Yes, it's something that's certainly been thought of and is related to how do you reward stock and seeds for the bean stock and seed pool, for example. It's probably inappropriate to award the same amount for stock and seed liquidity as it is for the bean ETH pool, for example. So this might be a good time to discuss perhaps more of the generalized architecture that we are working on at Beanstalk Farms to build out for the silo, which is that similar to how like a balance or vault works, where once the assets are in the vault, you can sort of trade them in and out to other assets and move them back and forth within the vault. The hope is to turn the bean farm into a similar style vault, where right now you can take your beans and withdraw them from the silo and claim and sow them within the bean farm, if you will. But the hope is to build out a generalized infrastructure that allows and supports sort of arbitrary assets. So in addition to one of the ideas that we've discussed in the past was the ability to take your Ethereum, for example, and then send that Ethereum to Beanstalk and then have Beanstalk buy beans and sow them, or buy beans and deposit them. And then later on, you can withdraw Ethereum back plus or minus your gains or losses, or leave the excess in beans. And this architecture will basically support that from a generalized perspective, where you'll be able to send any assets to Beanstalk, and then either buy and sow with those assets, where Beanstalk will take them and buy beans with them and sow them or deposit them. But then more generally, the hope is to also support through effectively a whitelist that the DAO will vote on, different LP tokens and assets that are supported to be deposited within the silo. And so the way that infrastructure will effectively work is the bean denominated value of the LP tokens is the way that Beanstalk will denominate things. So each pool will require a bean denominated value formula associated with it. And then the DAO will need to approve, and it is somewhat arbitrary, the amount of stock and amount of seeds per bean denominated value deposited for each LP token and beans, or potentially other assets as well. And so there's a lot of flexibility there. And as the ecosystem grows, there is something to be said for repricing the stock and seeds per bean denominated value for different assets, if that makes sense.
Got it. And I guess as you mentioned this in your first comments about going potentially cross-chain or operating multi-chain, and when we think about all this stuff in the future, having multiple tokens in the ecosystem, what exactly are the trade-offs? And I would actually love to hear this because I'm trying to wrap my head around this myself. We've had a few discussions in the chat about either going cross-chain, and then a few discussions about Beanstalk itself existing on multiple chains. What exactly does that even mean in either implementation, and what, if any, are the trade-offs of going one way or another, whether it's cross-chain or multi-chain?
So that it's good to be clear, and this is one of the places where two things more or less mean the same thing, but at the same time, there are various different ways to be cross-chain or multi-chain. So we don't have necessarily a distinction to make between cross-chain and multi-chain and generally use them interchangeably. But there is a difference between having a bridge and bridging assets to another chain and deploying Beanstalk natively on other chains. So the two different versions in practice would be in one case, you only have Beanstalk, the contract running on Ethereum, and then you can take your beans or your stock and your seeds and move them over to another chain to farm them or do whatever you want or use them on an L2 or whatever you'd like. But deploying Beanstalk on other chains enables you to deposit beans in Beanstalk on any of the chains which Beanstalk exists on, or sow beans in the pod line from any of the chains that Beanstalk exists on. Or more generally, if we talk about the more general bean farm vault structure that is being developed, you'll be able to take an asset that has liquidity against beans on one chain that Beanstalk exists on and trade that into assets on another chain that Beanstalk has liquidity with on that chain, assuming that there's a Beanstalk deployed on both of those chains. And with the exception of slippage on those exchanges, there shouldn't be any additional fees associated with that. And therefore, Beanstalk, because it can exist and be deployed on a wide variety of different chains, Beanstalk does offer, as compared to something like Terra Luna, native interest on a variety of different chains, as opposed to needing to bridge the assets to different chains. And if you think about the risk profile of being in the silo, where you're already have the risk exposure of owning beans and this, the security risk of the smart contracts and the ability for beans to maintain the peg because you own the beans, the return for being in the silo does somewhat resemble a risk-free interest rate. And so the ability to deploy a Beanstalk contract on a wide variety of different chains means that you'll be able to access a risk-free interest rate on any of those chains that Beanstalk exists on, which is very unique.
Thank you. That helps clear it up. I'll have to do some more research on my own. And I mean, look, in terms of what would be ideal, how do we look at this from an ideal perspective? What would be the best for Beanstalk?
So when it comes to ideal, one of the realities of the state of the technology of blockchains and technology built on cryptographic primitives is that they're still not great at talking to one another. And so while we were highly encouraged by Stellar Network, and they have a proof of stake blockchain that will allow or support up to hundreds of validators, they currently only have around 24, or when we spoke to them, they had a little under 24, but that was a little while ago, and they had just launched their new chain. So things are still early from a cross-chain infrastructure perspective across the board. And while Beanstalk doesn't need particularly sophisticated cross-chain messaging, it does need to be able to trust those messages. And so having more than one different chain that can provide sort of redundant messages will go a long way towards creating that ideal solution. But beyond that layer of complexity, which will take a little bit of work to iron out and potentially find other bridges beyond Stellar that Beanstalk can support, the ideal implementation is somewhat native to Beanstalk in the sense that Beanstalk is very easily deployed on an Ethereum layer 2 or very easily deployed on AVAX, and obviously not so easily deployed on Solana, but with a little bit of development can also be deployed on Solana. So the ideal implementation is within reach because of the native architecture of Beanstalk, but there is some real development work to be done to get from here to there.
Understood. Yeah, we've discussed this a little bit in the Twitter spaces as well. And just from a consumer perspective, ETH continues to be very expensive to transact on. So in the event that it is available or Beanstalk is available on some of the more cheaper chains like, AVAX or maybe even a Solana, that might attract some folks who may be priced out. Especially, if we're going to be entering a realm where there are many different types of tradable tokens and, each comes with some form of a transaction cost. Last question, I think, at least, unless there's more. And once again, if you're in the crowd, feel free to either dump a question to the AMA-questions channel under Beanstalk A&T University in the Discord, or this is easier, just raise your hand. And we do have a hand raised, actually, Humble Farmer. Maybe why don't we take a little break and bring up Humble Farmer for a quick cue.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you for bringing me up. I wanted to discuss the weather. I've started this conversation on the economics channel, and I was wondering if we can talk a little bit about it here. This is more of like brainstorming, and then you let me know what you think of it. My understanding is right now the way that the weather changes, the direction depends on are we above or below the peg, and then how far are we from the equilibrium that we want, or the ideal depth. And then the acceleration depends on the demand of the soil. So this is how fast we go, and it's capped at 3%. This is as fast as the weather would increase or decrease. I was thinking, would it make more sense if we have, first of all, weather to change as a percentage of the current weather? So it's not capped at 3%, it would be a percentage of what's the current weather. And then have it move depending on how far are we from the peg, which will implicitly bring in the demand for the soil. So for example, if we're close to 1, then we don't really need the weather to, I didn't mean that we don't really need it. I don't know if this is how it will turn out to be or not. But if we're close to the peg, then weather can go down instead of continuing to increase. And if we're far away from the peg, that's when the weather can increase and can go at a much higher rate than 3%. And the rationale or the thinking behind it is, the further we are away from the peg, then we want to give a higher incentive for people to jump in right now and as soon as we're just moving closer to the peg, we don't have to cross peg, then the weather will go down. You'll still have an interest rate, but it doesn't have to be as high as far away it was from the peg. Does this make sense? And if it does, tell me, what do you think about it?
So love where your head is at, and the way that you classified the mechanism is generally entirely correct. Now, the weather changes are first and foremost designed to encourage an efficient soil market. And so it's very much a behavioral economics question, and you highlighted that with some of your ideas. Now, as a starting point, let's evaluate where Beanstalk is right now. It has a particularly high weather rate of over 4,100%, and the weather moving 3% is pretty slow. Now, if Beanstalk changed the weather as a percentage of the weather, that would lead it to start to increase the weather exponentially during periods of time where there was not demand for soil, which on the one hand does potentially increase the rate at which Beanstalk will find the optimal weather rate, but on the other hand does increase the reward for waiting the marginal season or 2 seasons to sow. And it also greatly increases the cost that Beanstalk has to pay to lenders. And so given that at the margin, it may actually cause people to be more hesitant and wait, having the weather increase in a linear fashion, especially during periods where the weather is on the higher end and there's just not a lot of demand for soil in this range, it's probably less a question of should the weather be 4,100% or 4,200%, and more a question of continuing to bring Beanstalk to a wider audience and demonstrating that even at its high weather, it continues to oscillate the price above and below the peg. Now, it's also helpful to think about how the weather changes work when there's a much lower weather, let's call it single or double digits, where a 1 to 3% weather change is much larger. And so in those scenarios, they have more of this effect already where as we just discussed in the case where you have very high weather and now you're changing the weather as a percent, or the weather is increasing 40% in a season maybe. Similarly, if the weather was 10% and now it could be 13%, that is at the margin a big difference. And so when the weather is lower, it does actually play more into this inefficient market. But at the same time, if you move the weather as a percentage of the weather when it's 1%, for example, it may never go up fast enough, and that's how you create a real positive or a real negative feedback loop, or a larger dead cycle. And so the point is, when Beanstalk is in a more sustainable position with a lower weather, it's happy to be a little bit more aggressive and maybe at the margin be slightly inefficient on the soil, but quickly find the efficient weather rate necessary, or the weather necessary to attract demand for soil to return the price to the peg. But in general, like once we get into the longer debt cycles where the weather is going to be in the higher hundreds or even thousands, it doesn't benefit Beanstalk to quickly increase the weather from 4,000 to 5,000 to 6,000 to 10,000, because that's how you very quickly enter a death spiral. So it's better to take it slow and steady. At the same time, we would say that we don't think that the way that the weather changes are set are optimal. This is one of the places where we think the model can continue to be improved. So we would highlight 2 places. One is measuring demand for soil, particularly after BIP9. It's almost always executing the complex weather. And while that's fine, the economic problem of how do you measure or consistently measure or come up with some sort of consistent measure for demand for an asset that has a very volatile supply from season to season. When the price is above 1, you may have 5,000 soil. When the price is below 1, you may have 50,000 soil. How do you compare demand from season to season? So that's one place that can be further improved from an efficiency perspective under the new rules. And a somewhat related question is, maybe there are certain scenarios separate from changing, the weather changes from 1% to 3%, or somewhere in that range. There might be certain cases where it's beneficial to Beanstalk to decrease the weather maybe 10% in a season, just to test out whether it can pay a lower weather. So maybe if there are consecutive seasons where the TWAP is greater than 1, it jumps. And again, we're hesitant to have it on the flip side where if there are consecutive seasons below $1, it jumps, because Beanstalk isn't necessarily in a rush to jump the weather up, and that does come with its own negative effect on individual behavior. So those are some thoughts on the weather. We definitely agree it's not perfect, but would be hesitant to make the change to the changing the weather as a percent of the weather, although that's certainly an idea we've considered at length.
Thanks, Publius, and I agree with you with regards to having the weather increase as a percentage of the weather as it's increasing can lead us to a death spiral. I was thinking having the weather change as a percentage of the weather depending on how far are we from the peg. So once again, if we're like close to $1, then the weather would actually decrease. And as if we're far away from the dollar, then the weather would increase. So right now where we are is that the weather will only start to decrease once we are above the peg for some time, or which is when the demand for the soil is there. If we measure the demand of soil implicitly, but because if the bean price is far away from the peg, that tells you that the demand is low, or when it's higher than the demand is there. So we kind of already have a measure of the demand of soil through the price of bean itself. So the thinking again is, if we're far away from the peg, or as we're going away from the dollar, instead of right now where we're only saying are we above or below, we want to see how far are we from the dollar. And if we're far away, then we'll have weather increase, and it increases at a much faster rate. It doesn't have to be the 3%, so it becomes as a percentage. And as we're going closer to the dollar, then the weather would decrease, and it can decrease again fast. My thinking again is that this will change the incentive of how people think. So we don't know right now. We know that it will take a lot of time, for example, for the weather to start decreasing. Giving that at the rate it decreases. But if as the price of the bean goes towards the peg, then the weather will go down. It will still have some percentage to continue reaching to the dollar that we want, but it won't be 4,000. It can become like 2,000 suddenly. And if we go again to like 90 cents, then it goes again to like 4,000 or so on. I'm not sure if this is clear or it makes sense or not.
Love where your head is at. And in general, this is a very interesting idea. Very interesting. There are two concerns. One is, to us, we would actually look at the price deviation from the peg as less of an indication of where the weather is at relative to the optimal level as compared to the consecutive seasons below the peg. That's just our initial reaction. And specifically in instances where there's extended periods significantly below the peg, demand for soil is still probably a better reference point. And we're hesitant to introduce additional complexity to the model, which has been built on sort of as much simplicity as possible. But at the same time, you do raise a very interesting additional way that similar data points can be further incorporated into the model, which is really neat. One thing that we're hesitant of is, or take into consideration, which comes to mind in your proposal, is whether this potentially, let's say we switch to the TWAP idea, where if there are consecutive seasons below $1, the weather increases more. That may increase the reward for some sort of price manipulation, where someone is willing to bear the cost to keep the TWAP below $1 to create a marginal additional increase in the weather. But speaking out loud, that actually doesn't seem particularly likely. And there is something to be said for maybe based on the consecutive seasons that have had a TWAP below $1, maybe slightly increase the rate that the weather increases. But again, that might get you into closer to moving things up too aggressively, because it's like if today the weather was 4,400 instead of 4,100 because there have been consecutive seasons below $1. Honestly, not sure that would have Beanstalk in a better position based on the current market that it's in, where it's more a question of attracting a newer audience based on its already general proof of concept of returning the price to the peg, and that newer audience will hopefully help Beanstalk deleverage under its new rules. But this is a very interesting idea, and we would have to give it more thought to really give you a better answer. But very impressed by this idea, and we'll definitely be giving it some more thought on our end.
Thanks, Publius. My last question is, do we have a way to simulate the protocol if we want to play around and, just play around even with the demand and the supply of beans and see how the model is reacting? Do we have something that's off chain that we can run this? Is this something that's modeled somewhere?
So one of the things that we're actively trying to develop at Beanstalk Farms is a really best-in-class suite of analytics tools. At the moment, nothing like that really exists that would really fulfill what you're talking about. But in general, there are community members that are working on various various analytics tools like Bernoulli Bean. And additionally, Publius, do you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, just was gonna say that you can, just deploy a local blockchain node and, test through that. You can also use the Robson testnet, MetaMask to Robson. You can access Beanstalk on the test network, and you can call seasons there and do everything. So those are a few options.
Thank you. Is there a guide on how to do that? I kind of understand what these networks are, but is there a way where I can read more on how can I access that and play around in that environment?
Not currently, but if you DM us, we can answer all your questions and, maybe put.
I think you're cutting out, but what you're saying is that I'll DM you and then maybe you can give us instructions, which I will do. Thank you, Publius and Publius.
Totally. And maybe we can work together to make a guide.
Sounds great. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time answering my questions.
All right, thank you, Mod323. And by the way, that's it's a mighty fine bean profile picture you got there. It's got the hat, the goggles. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to raise your hand here. We'll bring you up or dump them into the AMA questions. So I guess moving forward slightly, we're coming up on the hour, obviously. So just want to take a quick look at the future, unless we have any more questions on what's going on in the present. But to the point of, I was just staring at the protocol, to the point of the weather and the pods and the pod line in general, deleveraging. This continues to obviously be a theme in Beanstalk, and we've passed a few bips. We've continued to think through different ways to mechanically deleverage, aside from the obvious solution of bringing in more folks, which we're also working on. Publius or Dumpling or anyone really, if you had to sell this to someone, from the perspective of someone looking at this protocol, someone new, they're looking at a pod line that's got 580 million pods to potentially pay off. So it's about 1.2 billion beans that would need to be produced. They're looking at an LP in a silo that, the listed APYs are obviously small, but that's not, they're not actual APYs. They're looking at a silo and an LP that is, effectively not paying out given the price of beans. I guess what would you, if you ran into someone on the street and they were like, hey, I'm looking to get into some, something in DeFi and you want to talk about Bean, and obviously you wouldn't tell them who you were, Publius, but what would you tell them? For someone looking at the protocol for the first time now, what would you tell them in order to get them to join and potentially deploy some capital?
So we try to go out of our way not to sell Beanstalk per se, and instead to just speak substantively about the protocol. But to try to speak to what you're asking about IPO and chill, about what the actual opportunity here is and why we're so excited about Beanstalk. If you consider at a macro level what's going on, I mean, there's so much to be excited about, but the starting point is, as compared to ESD or DSD or basis cash or any of the other previous attempts at a purely algorithmic, non-collateralized stablecoin, none of them have lived as long as Beanstalk has lived. Beanstalk has now been alive for a little over 5 months, whereas the rest of them, I think ESD lived the longest and was around 4 months. And Beanstalk seems to be in a relatively sustainable position from a peg maintenance perspective for the next couple of weeks. And even with ETH really down bad over the past couple of weeks, Beanstalk has hung out in the low 90s, despite the fact that prior to ETH taking a dip, there were still excess supply below $1, people willing to sell beans below $1. And so you combine that with an ETH dip, we're not particularly surprised by the period of time here below $1. But if you zoom out at the price chart and take a look at the all-time price chart, that is, in our opinion, something to get super, super excited about. That the volatility seems to be coming down gradually, and with hopefully an increase in the liquidity in the Bean3 curve pool over time as it's integrated into Beanstalk, that will result in even less volatility around $1. The more general opportunity that gets us very excited comes from the specific economic position of Beanstalk. So currently the supply is only around 42 million beans. But on the pod line side of things, there's almost 600 million pods. And so as Beanstalk starts to pay off its debt and increase its supply and decrease its pod rate, right, ultimately Beanstalk is designed to optimize not just around the price, but around the debt level. As the debt level starts to come down, and that proof of concept that Beanstalk isn't just able to oscillate the price above and below $1, but is able to decrease its debt level over time. Our expectation is that Beanstalk will, between all of the development happening with Beanstalk Farms and hopefully the growth around Beanstalk to supplement that, our hope is that Beanstalk will go through a larger deleveraging over the next 3 to 6 months and grow to around the size of other, newer stablecoin implementations like FEI and Frax and UST. And in doing so, and deleveraging and growing to that size, Beanstalk will also demonstrate its model at a macro level and then be ready to hang with the big boys, if you will. So the hope is that will all transpire over the next 3 to 6 months. And so not to evaluate the specific risk return opportunity, but this does, in our opinion, appear to be a very high leverage opportunity for Beanstalk and its position within DeFi. And once things get going and Beanstalk is at a couple billion beans and at the size of a FEI Frax, it will be, while still a very unique and interesting value proposition with much less risk associated with it because of the lower pod rate, there will also be less reward in terms of a lower weather to go along with that. And so this is, if you believe in the opportunity ahead of Beanstalk, this is a fabulous time to acquire exposure to Beanstalk. So again, not trying to be a salesman in any capacity, but just looking at the opportunity ahead of Beanstalk from an economics perspective, things do seem to be in the short term somewhat sustainable, and in the long term very ripe for larger growth.
And IPO, just because you mentioned me, I'd step in as the salesman for just a second, and I'd basically say that listening to Publius there, if I was chatting with those folks on the street, what I would probably say to them is, here's some information about Beanstalk. Here's where I think it's going, and I would ask them to decide on a percent chance that we would reach, say, 1.2 billion, and if they threw a percent back at me, like 5%, 10%, 20%, then I would take them to the field and I would say, by sowing these beans, you're offered a 41 to 1 return. So as long as it's, as long as you think there's a 2.5% chance, then that's fair odds. And if you think there's a 25% chance, then that's pretty darn good odds. So, that's one way of looking at it. That's only one way of investing in Beanstalk. But I think that from my perspective and from most of our perspectives here, I think we stand a pretty darn good shot at making this thing work. And new investors are being offered, although, yeah, it's a long wait. It could be a long wait. It's a pretty amazing risk reward opportunity. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and might be something you could say to those potential investors. There was one question that I'll bring up after your IPO. I don't know if you had anything else, but there's another question.
I might just add to that, that to us, the most exciting development around Beanstalk is the growth of the DAO and the community and Beanstalk farms, and the quality of individuals that are working on Beanstalk in a part-time or full-time capacity and quitting their jobs to work full-time on Beanstalk. That gets us really excited about what is to come. So it's not just about economically. Beanstalk is doing relatively well, which is fabulous. The quality of the support around Beanstalk is getting to a level where we are starting to feel very good about the way that we've gone about developing Beanstalk, which is from the ground up, very much, no pre-mine, no team allocation, no pre-sale or anything like that. The proof is in the pudding with the quality of people that now have exposure to Beanstalk and want to commit themselves to making Beanstalk a reality. So very, very exciting development from that perspective.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And it's not, it is amazing to all the people who are, working with everyone. And it's just a really great group of people. And yeah, so I don't go out and tell all of my friends or everyone to buy beans or to sow beans, but people have approached me and said, "Hey, what's this thing you're so obsessed with and what that you've been spending so much time on? And I want to invest in it," And so it's kind of like, by not selling it, you're almost selling it. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the ultimate goal, right? To be walking around on the streets of wherever you are, and people are just asking you about beans. So we're working hard to get Bean to be a household name. I was going to make that point, Publius, about the community. It's just amazing to see. We almost have 2,000 folks in the Discord. We have active Twitter chatter, and it continues to grow. Maybe to talk a little bit more about community and community involvement, we always make it a point in these AMAs to discuss, different ways folks can get involved, and that's also been more formalized recently. Dumpling, maybe this is one for you to talk about, since you're a shining living example. What are some interesting highlights on the community side of things? What have we kind of built over the last couple of weeks in terms of organization? And then are there needs that the community can help fulfill?
Absolutely. Yeah. As much as we've built and as much people who have flooded in to help, we also do have several, kind of open positions, things that we need help with. In the last couple of weeks, we've been kind of really fleshing out the org chart and the organization of things through both Notion. You may have noticed the Discord has been kind of reorganized, and just building out the DAO in general. You know, organizing things in terms of roles and responsibilities for certain members, communication, best practices. You know, so it's been quite the infrastructure month, which we're kind of finishing up here. A lot of the project management side of things is really coming along. There's a new way to apply if you have interest in working for the DAO. You can go on the sidebar, you can scroll down to DAO Beanstalk Farms, and you can hit apply and look in the different departments for what's needed. If we have technical people with experience, technical writers with experience writing like docs for, I mean, for other protocols, but maybe also for software, that sort of thing. We are looking for that. If we're also looking for folks in marketing who have good experience, you know, in marketing and leading groups of, you know, teams of people. And we're also on the business development side of things. Max So is leading that up, but he has now one or two people who are going to be helping him in a very part-time capacity, but people who have a little bit, you know, more experience in the business development side of things, be sure to reach out. And there will also be, if you want to get involved in kind of a more fun way, there's going to be, you know, in a more part-time capacity, the layer 3 bounties are going to be coming up really soon. So you can look at those. They're going to be expanded. It's going to be really fun. There's a lot of cool ones in there. So Farmer Dan has put those together, and those are going to be the first initiative that goes through Bean Sprout. So on the topic of Bean Sprout, that's another opportunity for people to, if they have their own idea, if they have an interesting idea that they want to move forward with, they can submit an application through Bean Sprout. That will be added to the both the Notion and the Discord here pretty soon. So an application for Bean Sprout. If you have an idea, say that you wanted to, for example, start a Beanstalk, there's been some discussion of a Beanstalk podcast. If you wanted to head that up, you know, buy microphones, get guests, organize all this, dedicate a certain amount of time to it, this would be the sort of thing you could submit a proposal to. That proposal would be reviewed by Bean Sprout, and then it would, you know, it would get refined, and then you would get a lump sum, you know, payment for your project, and then, you know, you could pursue that project, and that's through Bean Sprout, which is like our accelerator. So that's really exciting. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit. There's a ton of exciting stuff. If you don't know exactly where you might fit in, you can always DM me. We can have a quick chat, kind of a discovery chat, to figure out where you might fit in and what your skills are and interests are. And yeah, a lot of good stuff coming up in Q1. So look forward to speaking with you. IPO, I did have a question that I wanted to throw out to Publius real quick. It's kind of a micro question. This was, it was on the Discord, and I just jotted it down. It was, has there been any discussion of Beanstalk attempting to auto-arb its own pools, now that there are multiple pools? They'll inevitably be arbed by bots at some point, and it seems that the protocol trying to arb them themselves and distributing these profits to the silo or otherwise might improve the protocol and might be preferable to some rando doing it. So, Publius.
So this is where philosophically Beanstalk doesn't really work with something like that. So a lot of different stablecoin protocols use PCV or POL, protocol controlled value, or protocol owned liquidity to maintain their peg. And we really feel like the way to build the most robust, resilient money is to have the protocol itself make the least guarantees possible. Beanstalk makes no guarantees, in fact, other than your pods won't expire. It won't default on your pods. And as soon as you have some sort of arbitrage that Beanstalk is doing, you move away from that. Now, at a micro level, if the protocol is committing to buy and sell above and below $1 with a certain amount of liquidity, that also becomes very easily manipulable to various market participants, because they know beyond a certain threshold that there will be some additional volatility above or below the peg, and they can take advantage of that. And so as soon as you have Beanstalk commit to some involvement in peg maintenance, you expose the protocol to some sort of larger manipulation. And so the goal is to instead have an efficient market for beans, stalk, seeds, pods, soil, created through incentive structures that encourage a wide variety of market participants to all, over time, because of their own individual incentives, return the price of a bean to $1.
Okay, I think that makes sense. I could see how that would also add. The more complicated you make it, the more kind of attack vectors and things you could introduce, sometimes without even knowing it. And also, the introduction of arbs should help our stability, and that's, people won't arb unless there's an opportunity for that. So that's one other thing that pulled to my mind. But
Okay. One last point on the community. You're asking the community for help here. We are actively looking at different marketing agencies, folks in the Twitter sphere, and other individuals or groups or companies that can help do some outreach for the project for obvious reasons. So if you have any connections there, or you have any ideas or interesting things we can pursue, feel free to shoot me a DM. We have a couple of different folks working on marketing efforts, but we have a few meetings, Dumpling, you're aware of this, a few meetings scheduled this week, and we're definitely trying to make a ton of progress on that and make as much noise as we can out there. Good noise, though, very intellectual and proper noise, but noise nonetheless. So if you have any connections there, or know anyone who does, feel free to slide into my DM and let me know.
Yeah, we would just also highlight a couple people have mentioned that we should go on some podcasts. We're very open to that, and if the community has anyone that they'd like us to speak to on their podcast, we think at this point that's probably a good use of our time.
And just to speak on the layer 3 bounties that Farmer Dan is working on, one of them is introducing us to a podcast, and then if that podcast ends up getting recorded, there's a bounty for that. So that just a little added incentive for someone who wants to introduce us to a podcast.
Yeah, maybe we can have a couple of those.
Yeah, I think there's up to 5. We 0 to 5. So if no one does it, 0. But if 15 people do it, we'll do it for the first 5, or the biggest 5, or the most successful 5.
Yeah, if anybody knows Joe Rogan, do your thing.
Yeah.
ETH Wallet, what's going on? Do you have a question?
Hello, guys. How are you? What do you think about reaching some YouTubers, great YouTubers, to speak about Beanstalk? I think Twitter is good, but some people said that YouTube is better than Twitter.
Do you have any in mind, ETH Wallet? Like any?
No,
if you had a
suggest me
specific.
they are. No, well, as you know, there is a big YouTubers, but I don't know if they accept.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable place we could reach out and see. Were you thinking more of an interview format? We do have some videos that are being created that we'll be putting on YouTube, but as far as interviews, YouTube could be good. Or maybe we could, incentivize or pay people to do review, sort of a review of Beanstalk or, you know, a high level crypto person to do that. Yeah, maybe we could chat offline about what might be a good idea there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that could be a good bounty, and you know, ideally, some of the agencies we talk to, if we do end up, you know, engaging one, then ideally they have some connections there as well. Weebay,
I'm going to call you Weebay Tag.
What's up? It's Weebay.
Weebay. Got it.
I'm a
Weebay.
lifelong Bean guy, wondering, Publius, can we do some work to create some content that directly addresses the number one question and criticism of the Beanstalk from potential investors, which is why Beanstalk isn't a Ponzi scheme? Like, it would be great if there were a set of resources that directly responded to that particular framing of the question and criticism. Can we be a little bit more targeted in our materials? Because it seems like a lot of the stuff that I see on the Twitter and on the blog is highly technical and theoretical. It's like the Zuck approach to just sort of directly explain what's happening instead of responding to the narrative. But I think we should be responding to the narrative.
So I'll jump in quickly, Publius, before you do that. We definitely have resources. I think this is just a common issue of different things existing in different places. But Bean Merchant, who's in the same A as well, has put out an FAQ for Bean. It's, you know, aka the unofficial Bean FAQ. In that FAQ, the exact question, is Bean a Ponzi scheme, is addressed. I feel like you have to address that question.
I'm familiar with the doc. I don't think that, you know, all due respect to Merchant, my good friend, I don't think the messaging of that response is thorough enough. Like, we should revisit that.
Sure. And look, I'd be, given my work in marketing here, I'd be happy to connect with you. I completely feel you, because this is the number one question that I'm answering as well to folks, because I do think it's the number one question you do have to answer before, you know, folks get in, or some folks are actually looking for a Ponzi because they think they're going to get in early. Completely understand where you're coming from, and you know, we should definitely connect. But Publius, would love to hear what you have to say on this.
So, with regards to the macro comment of access to information and how to present that information and whether it's good to directly respond to it, hope right now there is sort of the white paper and then everything else, if you will. And there needs to be a lot more documentation around Beanstalk as it continues to grow, and to make that information really widely accessible. And while we're biased towards being really open about technical information, we recognize that people have other questions that need really thorough answers to as well. And so the hope is to move sort of to a Gitbook, a Beanstalk Gitbook, that contains all of that information in a nicely formatted way. And it's going to be a lot of work to get that up to par with the quality of the documentation of the white paper, for example, and to have it have different tones to reach different audiences. But that is something that is, you know, top of mind for Beanstalk Farms. And as Dumpling sort of gave a shout out, you know, if people are interested in working on technical documentation like the Gitbook, they should reach out. Now, to answer more substantively the question or criticism around Beanstalk being a Ponzi scheme, there's a couple. A, it totally makes sense why people want to understand that. B, if you look at something like ESD or basis cash, it sure looks like a Ponzi scheme. And so it's really important, as you say, Weebay, that there is a more clear answer to that. So there's a couple, both in practice differences, but then from a theoretical level, things don't quite line up with a Ponzi scheme. So in general, a Ponzi scheme is mechanically where you're taking money from one group of individuals and giving that money to another group of individuals. And one of the key differences here that makes Beanstalk not a Ponzi scheme mechanically is that Beanstalk isn't giving your money to someone else. because it has the ability to mint new money. And so instead, while there is still very much like needs to be an answer to the Ponzi-like dynamic, just at a micro level, there is that difference there. And the way that that plays out is that because Beanstalk can mint its own money and can incentivize new demand with that ability to mint money, in practice, the economics that prevent a collapse in the system is that Beanstalk needs to be able to mint enough money to pay off its debt over time. And that's where the sustainability comes from. And in practice, Beanstalk can mint more beans than there have been beans bought when there is a time-weighted average shortage of beans in the pool over consecutive previous seasons. So let's say someone buys 1 million beans on the open market and nobody sells, or 500,000 beans are sold, and so now there's still a time-weighted average shortage of beans in the pool of 500,000 beans. If there continues to be a time-weighted average shortage of beans for consecutive seasons, for 10 seasons, Beanstalk will mint 500,000 beans for 10 seasons. So despite the fact that only $1 million of demand came in, assuming that there are no sellers, there isn't necessarily any supply that is coming due. And so from a more macro mechanic level, Beanstalk, as long as it doesn't have people that are always, every time they get a new bean, willing to sell it right at $1, it can mint more beans that are used than are bought, and therefore pay off its debt level. Now, ultimately, this doesn't really answer the question of, well, you're just taking in money to mint more money. And so at the end of the day, it is really important that there is real utility for beans that are developed. Because in order to prevent people from just selling their beans at or around $1 or even below $1 during a run on the bank, the goal is to create real use for beans across DeFi. And so
Publius.
instead, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, that explanation makes sense to me. I'm a believer. So I think by and large, again, I'll repeat, I think our largest challenge is that many people do not understand or believe that explanation or view that as meaningfully different than the definition of a Ponzi to consider us something different than that. And I consider that to be, in my personal experience with Beanstalk, like some other people on this AMA have said, I've experienced that to be my biggest issue with helping incentivize new investment on the platform. People see me involved. They want to invest. I explain how it works. They say it's a Ponzi. I explain how it's not. But the ways that it's not are not sufficiently meaningful enough to make it feel not enough like a Ponzi scheme to make people interested. So I really, really think that a top priority for the DAO should be, like you said, creating new documentation that explains this better. The second thing is, we talk a lot about our ability to maintain the peg over time. And whilst that's like a mechanical issue that needs to be proven and borne out over time, obviously, because losing peg would mean we lose everything, it seems like we should be placing a much higher focus, even at this stage, on utility. And I know that's what, I forget what the name of the new program is, but that's what that program is developed to incentivize. But how much of your time are you spending between, thinking about the actual mechanics of the platform versus thinking about the ways we're building utility on the platform? Because as far as I'm concerned, there still has never been a Beans killer app. And until we get that, we'll really never, ever be able to escape Ponzi discussion.
Well, what you say is 100% correct. And Bean Sprout is designed to hopefully help incubate and develop one or more of those killer apps. So we would just echo that sentiment and say that we recognize that everything you just said is correct, and developing real utility for beans is essential. Now, we spend, I would say, a significant amount of our time on documentation at the moment. like when we're not on phone calls and working on the DAO and getting everyone organized on the DAO front and taking calls with potential protocol integrations, we're spending an excessive amount of our time working on documentation and maintaining the white paper and making sure that there's live documentation around Beanstalk, and we take your comments very seriously that there needs to be more focus on documentation around that type of messaging. And as we work on the Git book in the coming weeks, that will be a focus. And this is incredibly helpful and constructive comments.
Well, thanks. Please DM me if you want anybody to help. And long live Bean Merchant.
Yeah, we would also echo that sentiment. Bean Merchant is pretty epic.
There will be a snapshot to honor him as chief evangelist of Bean. Just wanted to mention
that. These beans, what's popping?
Hey,
eBay just sent you a friend request.
Yeah, I just came up to also kind of address some of the concerns that Weebay had. Definitely agree with Weebay, and we are definitely working on those concerns right now. As far as things that are going on in Beanstalk Farms, we've taken the past couple of weeks to do like a huge branding initiative, trying to really understand where we place in the market, our brand, who we are, who our target audience is currently. All of that content, all the creative content, all the things that we need to hit the people that we want to onboard are in the works for sure. And so, yeah, just wanted to kind of echo what Publius was saying about hopefully in the coming weeks, like we'll be able to see more of that come to fruition.
Right.
Thanks, Deez. I think we had a few more on the AMA. To Bean or not to Bean is asking, I believe the biggest area of doubt here, at least from people I've talked to, is how does Beanstalk begin to pay off its $600 million of debt and eventually get to that larger deleveraging and growing to the size of FAX for a UST? What will catalyze Beanstalk to be able to start that deleveraging process and get the ball rolling?
So naming a specific catalyst is very difficult. The hope is a combination of things like the curve pool, the pod marketplace, stock and seeds going live will start to create that general positive environment that is conducive to some sort of catalyst. Now, just speaking substantively, if you look at how Beanstalk behaved during its last growth cycle around Thanksgiving, that was really kickstarted, when like a single wallet put in around $1 million over a short period of time, a little over 200 ETH. And basically, if you go to the analytics of the website and go to the field and the harvested tab and go to all time, you can see that during that 2-week stretch from around Thanksgiving to around where the current pods harvested is, there was around 15 million pods harvested. And the growth of Beanstalk during that period was from around a 20 million supply to a 50 million supply. It increased by around 150%. Increasing the supply just here, another 30 million from 40 to 70, would result in a decrease in the pod rate under the new soil rules for BIP 6 and BIP 9, would result in almost a halving of the pod rate. And if you assume that Beanstalk grows 150%, now the pod rate is going to be down 60%. In short, that type of decrease in the pod rate should be, which again, shouldn't require that much capital to get going, should give Beanstalk a lot of wiggle room over the next couple months to start a larger deleveraging. And under the new soil parameters, we don't anticipate after that small growth cycle, no matter how large it is, if it's 30 million or 70 million, or I guess 150% would be 60 million of growth in the supply. We don't expect the pod rate to necessarily get this high again in the near future. And so the hope is that the environment is ripe for a larger deleveraging at some point over the next couple months once that initial deleveraging happens. And just at a micro level, we don't anticipate more than a couple $1 million of demand for beans are necessary to start that deleveraging. And so, again, we're more focused on developing technology that can help facilitate the catalyst for demand than on the specific demand itself.
That makes sense. And something I didn't understand until really probably a couple of weeks ago is that it's not like if we're trying to get Beanstalk to 1 billion beans and we're at 40 million right now, we don't need $960 million of buy pressure because of the reasons that you laid out in a couple of answers today, which is a big difference. FPO, do you have any other questions you've seen or wanted to ask?
I'm looking through the channel right now. Shout out Nasdaq, by the way. He put together a good document on the journey to a billion beans. So for folks who haven't seen that, please take a look. And also take a look at the Nasdaq Publius podcast. Someone asked earlier about YouTube. If folks do run podcasts, obviously look at the layer 3 bounties, but we can put content on YouTube as well. So I mean, it's a bit of a interesting question. Who's the other Publius? I think this might just be a good opportunity to just clarify for those who may be new. Publius, as far as we know, it's a team of 2 of you.
Who can say?
Yeah, who knows? Might even be Joe Rogan. You never know.
Yeah, there's elk meat in the fridge.
At least 2, I think we can say.
At least 2. It's like Mr. Smith in the Matrix. You never know. It could be everybody. I personally don't have any further questions. If folks want to raise their hand, maybe we can squeeze one more in. Anybody? We are recording this, by the way, so if anyone joined a little bit late, you can listen to the recording later and get a feel for what we talked about in the beginning. I think before we wrap things up, Publius, do you have any closing thoughts? Anything you want to say before we wrap up and head out? I have a few things to say too, but
we've already spoken a lot about the opportunity that Beanstalk has in front of it. I just want to use this as an opportunity to say thank you to the individuals that are actually making it happen. We really have been blown away by the level of interest and entrepreneurship and self-starterness that has been displayed by many of our incredible members of the community here, many of whom are PFPs in this call. And that's what gives us, it's not about the energy to wake up in the morning, but that's what gives us just this incredible fire inside that makes us feel like this is something real that's happening. And so want to issue a call for anyone else that isn't currently actively working on Beanstalk, but is curious and thoughtful and hardworking and wants to be a part of something great. And Weebay, we love the shout out here, so we'll definitely be in touch. There are a wide range of opportunities available for contributors, and want to get as many people involved in working on Beanstalk as possible. And so we really hope that this is just the beginning and are excited to continue on this journey with everyone.
Awesome. Dumpling, anything you want to add before I close this out?
No, I think we've pretty much handled it. I kind of shouted out everything I wanted to in the beginning of it. So yeah, go ahead. Let's wrap.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining in lieu of class today. I think this was super beneficial as they often are. Once again, this will be recorded, so feel free to hit up the Spotify when it's up. And look out for the rest of the week. We do a Twitter Spaces every single week. Dumpling is a part of that. Hype Bay hosts that as well. JWW joins. It's a great way to talk, not really just about beans, but just about DeFi in general, and to get additional folks in the Twitter community into getting bean pilled. So I usually send out, Dumpling adds it to the calendar, and I usually send out a notice in the chat. So keep your eyes peeled for that. That's weekly. And, most importantly, as we've talked about, the community not only has grown so much, but we're really all in this together, and the energy is very, very much unbelievable and positive. So if you do want to get involved and you do want to at least find out where you can get involved, please reach out to Dumpling. And moreover, if there are concerns, I think, Weebay did a great job of voicing some personal concerns he's been having that clearly we all feel. So if you do have concerns like that, feel free to, DM any one of us, and let's keep this moving and harvest these pods.
Oh, and go vote if you haven't checked out the snapshots yet. There's quite a few of them live. I think 15 or 16 are up there, so you can go take a look at those and vote.
Yeah, and snapshots are free, right, to vote?
Yes, free, no gasless voting. So
gasless voting, exactly. So exercise your right.
I'll post
all right.
the link in the AMA questions, just in case anyone doesn't know how to get there.
All right, the link is in the AMA questions. Go vote, do your duty, and thank you very much.